Welcome to the Estates Made Simple podcast with Jenna Carvello and Gordon Vanderleek. We are on a mission to simplify the world of estate administration, helping executors gain the knowledge required to manage an estate. Please note, the following is for informational purposes only and is not to be considered legal, tax, or financial advice. We recommend you seek individualized advice for your unique situation with qualified professionals.
Welcome to another episode of Estates Made Simple. It's always a spot on the calendar that I look forward to. Welcome, Jenna, my fabled co-host, to tackle another topic in the area of estate administration. For our listeners, thank you for being here. If you're listening on podcasts or watching on YouTube, we can't do this without your support. And so we appreciate those that take this information in and give us feedback. And we have another interesting topic. So to begin, welcome, Jenna.
Hi, Gord. Nice to see you.
Likewise. So the topic we selected for today is, should you tell your children what they are inheriting? It touches on a bit of the planning. If you're thinking about your future estate, clearly they're going to find out then, right? If whoever the executor is, has to, in fact, give notice, assuming it's parents leaving their estate to their children, the kids are going to find out because you have to file with the court an inventory. So there's that gathering of information about what do they have in the bank and here's the value of the house. And you have to put numbers in that application. There's a certain disclosure of that. And of course, during the administration of the estate, they're going to find out. But we thought we'd tackle today the topic of, in your lifetime or as you're planning your estate, what's the utility of having conversations ahead of time with regard to what their inheritance is going to be? What are the pluses and minuses, the pros and cons, the risks and the benefits? Because it can affect the administration of the estate. So we thought it was a relevant topic that way. Jenna, your thoughts on that in terms of what should be discussed? Can there be too much information? And what are some of the factors for our listeners to think about in the context of communicating what a future estate's going to be?
This is quite a common question I get when I'm working with clients is, should I tell my kids what they're going to receive or when is the right time? And I don't think there's a perfect answer for everyone, but I say in general, my preference is to tell them beforehand. You don't necessarily need to tell specific numbers, but to give them an idea of what they could be expecting, I believe sets them up for more success than if they were surprised down the road when mom or dad passes away. So I really like having those conversations early on. And I know it's difficult for a lot of families to do. Traditionally, you don't talk about money, you keep it secret and you don't want to open those doors. But having that conversation, I think, creates an atmosphere of transparency and allows the kids to ask mom or dad questions before they're gone. Perhaps it could also settle some hurt feelings, especially if the estate is being distributed not equally to all the kids. And so if you're sharing that with the children, it gives the children opportunity to ask why and have that discussion. And I think the conversation can also start to educate the kids around becoming successful stewards of wealth. Because if they weren't used to the wealth that mom or dad had, and then suddenly they get a windfall when mom or dad passes away, that can also be scary and overwhelming and perhaps leads to mismanagement of money and maybe not proper uses. So I think the education piece is crucial too. The parents can step in and ask their kids, how would that change your values if you receive this wealth? Would it change your work ethic? What would you do with the wealth? I think that's a powerful question too. If as a child, if I told my parents, oh, I would do so-and-so with the wealth if I received it, later on, when mom or dad passes away, I'm going to remember what I told them and what I promised them. And I think that holds them accountable too, to some degree, to make sure that they're not frivolous. And you've probably heard, I know there's a common saying that mom or dad didn't fly economy for the kids to fly first class. So it's all wrapped up into this, is making sure that they appreciate the funds, appreciate the hard work that goes into it, and get educated when the time is right. What are your thoughts and what are you seeing with respect to on the estate administration side, if the beneficiaries are unaware versus aware and how that relates to the estate admin?
And depending on what the plan is, especially if there's any unusual provisions or something a bit out of the ordinary, if we can call it that, then for sure, I think more communication is better. And I can think of a number of files that I've been involved with where there wasn't communication and it took a whole bunch of time for the kids to process. And where it's relevant from an estate administration perspective, that could lead to a challenge. Generally speaking, if people they're getting what they expect, it's trite to say they're probably not calling litigation lawyers to say, how can I challenge this? Or where do I stand on this estate? This doesn't seem fair. They're going to start digging into, could they challenge capacity? Was there influence of another sibling? Can they access any of those grounds of litigation? And the bar for starting litigation is pretty low, right? You spend your $250 in Alberta, you file your application, and there you're into the courts, right? Now, whether you're successful or not is a whole other matter. And there may be liability for costs, but it's not hard to start litigation, right? And it really can tie up the administration of the estate and completely change the timelines, the stress levels, and the responsibility. So I think in general, it makes sense to have a communication plan and to talk to your kids about it. I think a lot of parents are really concerned about how much do I disclose? And I think it's a fair thing to say, I'm not going to show, and you said this earlier, but just to elaborate on that a little bit, maybe not get into all the numbers, because maybe the parents are not comfortable if they have some wealth. Would the kids change if they knew the parents had that wealth? Particularly in a situation where the parents may have a very modest lifestyle, but they have significant wealth on that. There may be a surprise, right? And it'd be better to develop a plan of how you're going to educate your kids on that. And that's not a once and done strategy. I would think that's an ongoing strategy. Maybe you start very simple and 5 years later you have another conversation and it's getting into a little more detail. And 5 years after that, it's a little further detail. Recognizing also that the kids are going to find out eventually. We already referenced it. They're going to find out in the estate. But remember, if one of your kids or your children are in fact under your power of attorney, if you become incapacitated, they're going to find out because they're the ones who are going to manage it. So the sense of there's a benefit of keeping it a secret. In some family situations, you could argue too much is not good. But in general, having a communication plan and talking to them about that day would be helpful. It's certainly going to be relevant for your choice of executors. If you have wealth, depending on how much is there, may determine who you choose as an executor. If it's a really small estate, do you need all three of your children to be the executors? Probably not. Pick one. If it's really complicated, maybe you need more than one, right? Or maybe you need a corporate executor. So I think it's part and parcel of planning for that to set your kids up for success, or whoever your executor is, that they're aware of what's going on. Litigation's a real thing. It's a risk. And I think in many cases that I'm involved in contentious estates, if there was more communication, in more cases than not, I'm concluding that the litigation could have been avoided. Yeah. So I think it's a good financial strategy to say, let's talk about what makes sense for communication, because it could save us money in the estate, which leaves more money for the kids, because we're not going to have the kids fighting or at least upset about what we've done. And so I like your comment about it. There could be an unequal distribution. We see that often in the context of if there's a special needs child, a child with a long-term disability, and the parents go, I need to leave more. I would rather have the other kids hear about the rationale for that decision straight from the parents. Right. They're likely less upset than they find out about it after the funeral.
Absolutely. And I think just hearing you speak to, if we're able to decrease litigation in the long run, that keeps the family harmony. So you might have a little bit more difficult conversations now, but it's much easier than after the fact. So yeah, hopefully that gives our listeners some guidance. There's experts in this field to lead family discussions and to have education sessions. Highly recommend you seek out those experts. Also, something that many parents consider is gifting prior to death. And a small lump sum could perhaps be a nice test to see how they'd deal with the big inheritance in the end. And so that can be a fun exercise to go through and a conversation to explore too.
I think maybe to add on that conversation, if there's trusts that are part of your estate plan, especially for adult children, it may be also appropriate to have a conversation about what's the purpose or the rationale for that trust. A child may be very upset to say, why wasn't it just a gift? Yeah. So you're setting up for a conflict between the child, in our example, and the trustee of the trust, which again could lead to a more contentious situation, and professional advisors are involved, and it's just more difficult versus they understand why there's a trust. And sometimes there's good reason. Protection against claims of creditors, or keeping the property separate in terms of matrimonial claims, or just understanding how it's going to be dispersed out and the reason why the parent is doing that. I think those are useful as your children age. In adulthood, they're going to be in a position where they understand finances, they understand your values, what's important for the family, and what mom and dad wanted with that money. So really important, I think, for trust with adult children to have a good sense of why that trust is there, what's the purpose of the trust, educate about what is a trust anyway, so there's not misunderstandings. And that way, when the estate plan gets implemented as part of the estate administration, they're getting exactly what they expected. There's recognizing, of course, if you don't do the communication, they are learning about all this stuff in a highly charged emotional situation, right? They've just suffered a loss. People are not always on their best in that case. It's a major life event to lose a loved one. If you're thinking of, from a child's perspective, losing a parent. And in the process of that highly emotional situation, and a lot of unique feelings are coming up that you don't have to deal with on a regular basis. So there's a challenge there. On top of that, we have this complicated legal structure that you don't understand. And what does this mean? And maybe interpreting it the wrong way. That just adds to potentially the conflict, but just the emotional response to that scenario. Did mom and dad not trust me? Is that why the trust is there? Why not have that conversation ahead of time? And then they would realize it had nothing to do with trust. It was about making sure that money stayed in the family, and they were concerned about an in-law or something, or wanting to segregate those funds, or worried about a child's vulnerability, or the need for some professional management of that through a corporate trustee. And there could be all sorts of reasons. I hear those on the planning side of it, but I sometimes wonder how much of that is being shared. And I think there's a lot of benefit in sharing on an appropriate basis. So I like your opening suggestion, which was there isn't a one size fits all. We can't make a generalized statement, but think about, in preparation for your estate, what's a good communication strategy, and come up with something that makes sense for your family.
Absolutely. I think that provides our listeners some good things to think about. Thank you all for joining us today and learning a little bit about what we can talk to our kids as they're preparing to receive wealth. Please feel free to subscribe to wherever you listen to podcasts and submit some ideas of topics. We're always happy to consider your topic ideas and hopefully provide some education along the way. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time.